So Izzy and I are recording this video for ourselves and for all of you as part of a virtual film series we're doing featuring the films Coded Bias and Picture a Scientist. And this particular conversation is inspired both by many conversations we've had before, but also particularly by the first scene in Picture a Scientist, where a woman who is a geologist says, I was in my bunny suit, I had my goggles on, I was in my lab, and my 3-year-old daughter came to the lab and said, Mommy, you're a scientist. I want to be a scientist like you. And the woman says she just broke down crying. And she told her daughter it was tears of joy, but she said that wasn't really true. She realized she didn't want her daughter to experience the kind of things in science that she had experienced. And it motivated her to report things that had happened to her many years before that she had never reported. And that reporting actually ended up in a tenured professor at Boston University being fired. So it was very substantial in her case. And it was actually very well corroborated by things that happened to other women and by people who had witnessed what had happened to her. So my daughter and I watched that film together. And even though she also I'm a computer scientist, she also is getting her PhD in computer science. She's a second-year PhD student, and Izzy is just about to go be a PhD student in information science at the University of Washington. Did I get that right, Izzy?
Yes.
So, it's not like it's the first time we've ever talked about these things, but I was surprised the degree to which, after watching that film, we had a lot to say and felt pretty inspired to do a little more even than we had been doing. My daughter decided to join the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we are all inspired to make these videos, and there's going to be a panel discussion, but we have a lot more to say than we think will fit in the panel. And so we decided that we think stories are important, and not just the stories of, it'll be great, you can do it, you can do anything, but also the hard stories that say what we need to change. We don't want the people we love to be blindsided by the things that are challenging and by the things that happen to many of us and feel like they're the only ones. So we're feeling like this is some pretty hard emotional work we're about to do. And I'm really grateful that Izzy is willing to do this with me, and also the other women who are going to be joining us in the panel that we're going to do. And I believe this video will end up to be a part of that kind of collection of things. But we want the world to be different for each other and for the women that will come. And we want change. And to that end, we're going to tell you some stories. But first, we're going to introduce each other. I am delighted to introduce Izzy Grosso. Izzy is a student who has worked with me since 2018. We have 3 papers published together, 2 papers that are accepted but are going to be published next month. And we have 2 papers submitted for publication. Damn, that's good. And she is a Goldwater Scholar, which is an incredibly prestigious award. And she is a joy to work with. She regularly brings out some of the most insightful comments. Her comments suggest new directions we could go in. I will miss her terribly when she moves on to the University of Washington. All of the contributions that I have seen her make to big problems in the world almost never happened, because she was almost drummed out of academia by sexual assault. And that, I mourn that. And I continue to mourn the tax on so many lives and the cut off contributions of so many lives. And that is not Izzy's story. Izzy's story is the story of being an amazing researcher who's going to have a wonderful career. But there are other stories too, and we want you to hear some of those. And Izzy's going to tell some stories, and I'm going to tell some stories, not so much of sexual assault, but of definitely gender bias in big ways. So, okay.
Are you ready for me to introduce you? Yes. Okay, so I'm here talking with Professor Jeanna Matthews. Like she said, I have been working with her in her lab since 2018. We've been mostly working on looking at fairness and accountability and transparency in algorithmic systems, specifically looking at human-computer decision-making systems. And this has gone in a variety of directions, which has been really interesting and really fantastic for me. But I think working with Jeanna has been really great for me because I think when I arrived at Clarkson, I had really low confidence. I had transferred in from a community college where I had amazing experiences, but I just had really serious imposter syndrome. And Jeanna is just a force to be reckoned with. And she is so fierce and so intense, and is not afraid to say what she thinks and what she thinks is right. And that's been really important for me as someone who's being mentored by her. To see and to know that that's okay, and not that I don't have to make myself small, even if it's hard. So I've really appreciated that. And I think that's been really important for me as I've been slowly being molded into a researcher. I still feel like a baby in research, and I probably will for a long time. But so yes, Jeanna is a fantastic mentor in that way. Not sure if there's anything else I should add. There's so many things. I'll leave it there.
I feel the same way. I thinking back over the introduction, I know there's lots of things I didn't say. Like, I don't even think I said that you're an undergraduate data science major or so many fundamental facts, but we're going to go with
He's
that.
a computer science professor. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we decided at the beginning we were not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There's a lot of things we may have intended to say that we don't manage to say, but we're pretty sure that the stories we tell, even if they are even if we don't tell everything, is going to be worth it. So Izzy, I'll pass the baton to you.
Sure. So there are so many things that I think are important to talk about. I think that a large focus of what I'll be talking about will be centered around sexual violence and how that's changed the way that I move through the world. So I guess I wanted to put that out there as a content warning for anyone else who will be watching. And I just want to also acknowledge that that's not the only form of gender-based violence or discrimination that women and femmes experience. But that has been just a really big part of that. Being a survivor of sexual violence is a really big part of my identity. And it really has, as I said, shaped the way I've moved through the world. So I think I'm going to talk about that. And we'll see where it goes. So as Jeanna said, I did leave academia for a bit, and that was because of sexual violence, but I think it starts much earlier than that. And I think it's important to note that when we talk about sexual violence, it's not just this one adverse life event and this one incident, and that we have to move on and get over, and then we move on with our lives. And I certainly don't feel that way. And I think about it every day, and it has sort of been a pervasive presence in my life for a really long time. And I remember being really young and sort of knowing that men were going to try to do things to me, and I'm supposed to have strategies for avoiding that. And so I remember um, when I was younger, I was in it's interesting, it changed over time, but my household was pretty strict. And so my dad didn't want us to wear our hair down or wear makeup or specific clothes because that would be provocative for men, which to me is like this early sort of message that what happens to you is in your control and you should shape yourself and become smaller and become different if you want to avoid violence. And I remember, being at school and being sent to the office for what I was wearing and having to put on a stinky big t-shirt from Lost and Found because it made the male teachers feel uncomfortable that young girls have bodies and breasts and nipples and which to me is also a form of sexualization of young girls. And so I think that these experiences started to inform how I thought about myself, how I thought about women, how I thought about how men were seeing me. um, and I don't mean to talk about this in a binary space. That's just been my experience. And so the first time that I was sexually assaulted, I was 13. And I remember I was then sexually assaulted again when I was 16, when I was in high school, by a football player who was actually a friend of mine. And he asked me not to tell anyone, so I didn't. And then he told everyone that we slept together, and I was bullied for the last 2 years of high school a lot. And uh, but I still went on to college. I was actually assaulted again this summer between when I graduated high school and entered college, my freshman year at Trinity. And there I was then, I experienced a lot of sexual violence there, and I sort of spiraled and was really drinking a lot. I was skipping classes. I just was not functioning. And finally, the fall of my sophomore year of college, I actually transferred to UMaine to get away from that scene. I ended up failing all of my classes, and I moved back down to Portland and got a job bartending and started doing that. And I had no intention of returning to school. I thought that I had failed out. Um, and I was pretty devastated by that. I think I've always thought of myself as someday being a scientist. So I was the little kid who was, I remember being like obsessed with salamanders. I had all of these notebooks in which I would draw birds, and I knew all of the Latin names of the birds in the areas and their bird calls. I was just an extremely curious kid. And I think that anyone who knew me as a kid always thought like I was an avid reader. I would read under the tables at restaurants with my family and like avoid I would, it was very rudely. So it really felt like I had lost myself. And I think it's important to pause here and note that not everyone who leaves school has lost themselves, and if their paths change, that's okay. Um, and it just wasn't, for me, being a scientist is something that I know is the correct path for me, but that's not the correct path for everyone. And if you leave school and you go on a different path, that I don't want anyone to feel like that's wrong.
Good clarification for sure.
Um, and so I eventually went back to community college at Southern Maine Community College, which was this amazing environment. There were so many people from so many different backgrounds. I had 40-year-old people in my classes, people from different cultural backgrounds, and just everything felt normal. Like I didn't feel abnormal for being a 22-year-old who was, starting over again in terms of my college education. That felt normal there, and I think that was really important for me. Um, And so let's see, summer of 2018 was my first research internship. I had an REU, research experience for undergraduates through NSF, at Bigelow Labs in Booth Bay, Maine, where it was actually an ocean science. It's an ocean science lab, and I worked there with Nick Record, who is amazing, and I still have a great relationship with him. But I think it's important to note that even upon arriving there, I still felt like I was a failure. I was coming out of a community college. One of my roommates, she went to Harvard, so I was very intimidated. I remember saying to Nick that I felt like I shouldn't be here, and I think I might have even said something along the lines that like I can go if you want me to. Like I didn't think that I should have been there. But another thing that I want to note is that those first few days we're going through orientation and we're getting the tour of the lab, which is gorgeous. I found myself still feeling in survival mode and scanning the place, and noticing that the walls there are glass for all of the researchers' offices, and feeling this intense feeling of relief because my boss, knowing that my research mentor is a man and I hadn't met him and I didn't know him, and that immediately felt unsafe. And so while I'm supposed to be learning about the lab and getting excited for my research, I'm scanning for my safety and feeling like I'm afraid for my survival. And I remember on the first or second day, we ended up he asked if I want to go for a walk down to the dock. Booth Bay, Maine is gorgeous over the summer, and they have a dock, and it's a beautiful view, and it's a short walk down from the lab. And we ended up going for walks all the time. I went back there the next summer, and I love going on walks with Nick. But I remember that first walk feeling terrified because I didn't know him, and I felt like I was going to be in this isolated place with a man that I don't know. And I had learned from experience that that's unsafe. So I don't even remember what we talked about or the brainstorming about possible projects. Like I was in pure panic mode, you know. My nervous system was activated. I felt, like I wanted to flee. And we eventually cultivated this relationship, and he again is a fantastic mentor, and I think that if I had had a different mentor, I might not be in science now. Like that, I felt like that relationship was really important for me to feel safe and to feel like my ideas matter, and that I don't know. So I think that I can't show enough gratitude for Nick. But that tax, I think, is important to note that regardless of who it was, right? He's an incredible, kind, amazing, brilliant, safe mentor who I love working with. That those first few days, so much of my brain space was spent on worrying about my survival and worrying about being safe and trying to read his body language. And because I had learned that that was more important than research. Or I couldn't even discern that. I didn't have the option to decide, okay, I'm going to put that in a box. I'm going to think about research now, right? So I think about that all the time, about how much of my brain space those first few weeks were taken up not by research and by thinking about possible projects, but by thinking about my safety. And he's actually the person who introduced me to what algorithmic bias is. I didn't know what it was until then. I didn't know what machine learning was until then. So that was my first introduction, which led me to ask my advisor at Clarkson when I transferred that fall what he thought of it. And he said, oh, you should go talk to Jeanna Matthews. So I sought out Jeanna Matthews and I said, I'm interested in algorithmic bias. What can I do? And we started working together. But again, I wanted to emphasize that this isn't just one incident. It wasn't then, okay, now I feel safe and now I've moved on. And actually I'm working with a woman now, which immediately does feel safer. And that's has nothing to do with a mentor. It's just we've just been taught that. But even after that, that feelings of imposter syndrome because I had failed out of school were really entrenched. I still, arriving at Clarkson felt like I'm not supposed to be here. I feel that way about the University of Washington, even. I feel like I'm going to get there and they're all going to find out that I'm not supposed to be there. And I know that imposter syndrome is really common, but it feels like this really.
And you are amazing. You are amazing. A Goldwater scholar, huge GPA, so many research ideas. Amazing.
Thank
So
you. But yeah, I think that has stuck with me. And you know, I don't know. I think that people see people don't see failing out of college or dropping out, in response to trauma as, an act of self-care. They see it as a failure. And I saw it that way too. And I've internalized that and I'm working on it. I don't think I'm quite there, or I don't know when I'll be there or if I'll be there, ever. But my the person who assaulted me in high school, he ran for office in Maine this past summer, and that pushed my research back. So I remember he announced it in October of 2019, and I was working on a research project with Nick and with Jeanna, to talk about algorithmic accountability and the relationship between that and domain specific codes of ethics. So with Nick, I was working on ecosystem forecasting. And with Jeanna, we were talking a lot about algorithmic accountability. So we were working on this collaboration. And I remember wanting to get that done by the end of the year. And hearing that he was going to be running for office, I remember going to Jeanna and saying, I need a break. I can't do this. I can't do research right now. I can't think. And I did submit the paper, but I didn't submit it until May. So it's not that I was behind, but it was time taken away from me that feels stolen. And you know, he was in law school and I hadn't finished my bachelor's. And I don't think that I'm behind, although sometimes I do think that, but I don't think that's really true. But it feels unfair. And I think that that's part of it that people don't realize is that it continues. And then, Brett Kavanaugh happens, and that's deeply traumatic for me. So that was my first semester at Clarkson, and I isolated myself and I stayed home and I struggled and I got a C on an exam, which I never get C's. And I don't know. And watching how people talk about sexual violence and how people talk about women in, or like women's ability to code. I think that came out, was that in 2018 as well? That memo from the Google employee.
more when that was.
I'm not sure, but it was a few years back. And I remember seeing that and feeling like, wow, maybe this field that I'm entering is not a safe place for me. And wondering that and wondering if it was worth it, which it is. And I think that, I don't know, I just think that I really wanted people to know that this is something that has impacted me in so many different ways. When I was applying for the Goldwater scholarship, there was staff at Clarkson who, he worked on helping us all get our applications together. And there was a diversity statement where we could talk about how, any systems of oppression or social issues impacted us. So I talked about that story. And he told me that was an adverse life event. He really didn't want me to talk about it. He told me it would weaken my application. He questioned why I didn't report. He told me I had a responsibility to report to other women. And, he might be out there, assaulting other women, which he did. But he's not at Clarkson anymore. But, that was that felt like the biggest takeaway from the process of the Goldwater Scholar application for me, was fighting to have my voice and my story be where it was supposed to be.
And I remember you asking me about that and saying, like, the examples they're saying we can use in this are, I grew up in a rural area without a lot of access to special education programs or whatever, because Clarkson has that has that demographic, um, you know, and for him to say that your experience with sexual violence is not a legitimate thing to talk about, when those are, I was shocked. I was shocked.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, and those are legitimate things to talk about, but I remember sitting there while we would go in and work together as a team, all of the possible applicants, and there were, white men in the room being like, what do I do for this diversity statement? And that's what he recommended. He would say, well, where'd you grow up? Yeah, just talk about how it's rural. You didn't have a lot of opportunities, like he was helping them conjure up something that didn't feel real to them, while my very real experience was, he was trying to silence. And it didn't count. Where this conjuring of this fake experience, for some people it's very real, and they were able to write very beautifully about real experiences that were not mine, but there were people who didn't have anything to write about, and he helped them come up with something, and that felt really unfair. It was really unfair. um, and even applying for graduate school, I put that in my application to talk about, just my, I don't know, my arc as a student, right? And my research interests. I want to talk about I want to look at how people talk about sexual violence online, among many other things. And so having to go into interviews and explain that I'm a survivor of sexual violence, and that's what's motivating my research interests, and being, worried and afraid every interview that I might be met with a hostile response, that is a tax. That is a burden that I don't think that we should have to bear. And there are definitely, I don't want to say that it has all been negative. There definitely been, like I said, like Nick turned out to be an amazing mentor who I had such a, like, was so transformative for me, that experience at Bigelow that first summer, and really building my confidence and knowing that I want to be a researcher. And I remember my interview with the University of Michigan, Libby Hemphill, when I told a brief part of my story, explaining my motivations. She paused and said, I know this is sexual violence is really hard to talk about, and I just want you to know that I see you. And that was really important to me. And that was this feeling, it was a way of communicating, like, you are safe, you are seen, and you are heard, and so there have been people who have done that, and that has really made a huge impact in my life. But it has been something that I remember talking to Nick about and asking him, basically saying that I was struggling with figuring out who to have as a look for in a PhD advisor, because I wanted to know, are you safe? Can I talk about sexual violence? Can I be a person? Like, sometimes I have bad days and I need to take a day off, or something might happen, like a Harvey Weinstein event. Like, I need a few days off to like process that. Or when Daisy died, and um, she her story was so similar to mine, and she was an activist, and I needed some time to process that. And I don't think everyone in academia gives themselves or other people the space to really be human, and so I was trying to navigate those conversations, and I ended up not really seeking out any. I didn't want to have a man as a PhD advisor because it felt like the risk was high, and it didn't feel worth it. And I have met incredible, like at the University of Washington, I've met incredible men who I'm sure I will be really happy working with. But I specifically sought out, you know, women or non-binary folks, as PhD advisors, and So thinking about that tax, how many opportunities did I not look at for my own sense of safety? So I guess I'll pause there. I think I've been talking a lot, but I think that's some of the important pieces. I'm sure there will be other things to add.
Thank you, Izzy, for doing this with me. And thank you for sharing that all very bravely. I'm just totally struck by the constant tax that the and it's not death by a thousand cuts, because it's not death. You are going on like flourishingly well. But I still, I mourn what you could do if you didn't lose 2 years here and opportunities here and there, and can't concentrate on the brainstorming of your summer research because you don't feel safe, or just the maintenance that you have to invest daily and weekly in managing what you've dealt with. That it is a constant tax.
Yes, and I think that that's,
and it's not fair.
No, no, I was just going to say, and I think that that's one important thing, again, about the idea that it's not just one incident, and that it sticks with people. And so I don't feel like, I mean, I am so proud of where I am, and I am so psyched to go to UW. I'm so psyched about the work that I've done at Clarkson. And I don't feel like it's over, and that I've now won and I've now moved on. Like, I am angry. I feel, and I'm angry. I think about it every day. It still impacts my life in huge ways. And I'm sure it will forever. And I think that that's important. And that's another important thing to acknowledge, that like, I get afraid of coming off as like, I don't know. I'm like a huge fantasy fiction nerd. So like, I'm thinking about Sansa Stark, right? And they're like in Game of Thrones, and it felt like she was portrayed as like, she was raped and therefore became strong. And now look at her. And it's like, that's not the pathway to strength, is not like raping someone or beating them down or oppressing them. And I think that that doesn't mean that I'm not strong, but I don't think that, I don't know, I have a little bit, I like want to avoid that narrative.
Yeah, I think way too often we feel silenced by, oh, you're just you're being angry, or you want to be vindictive, or, why don't you just, why do you even have to talk about the past? Let's just move on. And that, when bad things happen, you have a right to talk about them and be mad about them, and want apologies, want acknowledgement, want change, want, not to have things swept under the rug.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not what is often held up as the ideal. I was able to put it behind me and go on and didn't complain, and went, that's what's kind of held up as an ideal. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's so healthy. I noticed this a lot in COVID, for example. Like, are we allowed to tell the hard stories, or do we just have to say, like, I think maybe in COVID, more people get it. Like, this is happening. People are really experiencing trouble, and very differentially. Some people are really being impacted and some people not. And because it's, I think, affecting a larger swath of people get how damaging it might be if the people who are really having struggles don't get to talk about that, or are made to feel like it's just them. But in many other cases, that same scenario plays out. Different people are differentially affected by the things that happen to them, and being like, oh, why do you have to talk about the bad things? Can't we just like put a smile on it and go forward? It's like, we're going forward. Like, look at all the going forward happening. But I also want to talk about what happened. And I
Yeah.
want change. I don't want to just sweep that under the rug, right? I mean,
Yeah, and I think that that's the piece where, and I don't want to, again, any way that any person who experiences, again, my story is really centered on sexual violence, so I'll just say that, but anytime someone's experiencing sexual violence in whatever way feels right to them to heal, like, is great. And I don't want anyone to feel like there's something wrong with them if they don't want to talk about it. You don't have to talk about it. You don't ever have to. It's your story. You could do with it what you want. And I think that that I do agree with you in the sense that we're really encouraged to show, like, this is the comeback story. And I've noticed that a lot with COVID, where people have been really pushing, well, you have so much time now, so be productive. Now's the time to get your beach body, or whatever, which are also horrible narratives for their own reasons. And on top of it, basically not letting people or not wanting people to acknowledge, like, we are going through global trauma and we are humans. And so I feel less productive. Yes, I'm not spending as much time driving back and forth. Maybe I do have less responsibilities. And I've actually cut out a lot this past semester because I need space to mourn. I mean, over 500,000 people have died in the US, like, alone. Like, people are grieving, people are experiencing loss, and they're losing jobs, and they're losing opportunities, they're losing loved ones, and it's just scary. Even if you haven't lost a loved one, you're going through every day with fear. And again, it feels like that, not allowing the space to be human, to experience trauma, to not feel weak for experiencing trauma, to be okay with your body changing because your world is changing, or your, I don't know, your priorities changing, or yeah, I don't know.
and if someone is feeling extra productive in COVID, good for them. They have a right to that story, but they don't have a right to diminish anyone else's story.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that a lot. There was an incident just this semester in a faculty meeting, actually, where we were talking about an experience that had been very gendered. There was quite a few women that were offended, and you know, um, and it happened in one meeting, and we asked to talk about, some of us, there was a group of women that asked to revisit it and talk about it the next time, because we felt like it had not been handled fairly or well. And that we started that conversation, and then immediately one woman spoke up and said, I don't think I've really experienced gender bias. I think if you go looking for gender bias, you'll find it, but that doesn't mean it's really there. And it took me a little while to really come up with exactly what I wanted to say in response. But it really boils down to, you can say you haven't experienced something, but you don't have a right to dismiss what someone else has experienced. And basically, I thought about how what she said would sound in another context. Like, for example, climate change. The data on gender bias is pretty clear. The data on climate change is pretty clear too. And if I said, if you go looking for a hot day, I'm sure you're going to find one. That doesn't mean that climate change is real. Look at me, I'm not hot. That's not the point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every one of us has a right to say, I've had excellent mentoring. I haven't experienced gender violence. It's been great. That's good. I'm totally productive during COVID. Good, right? Nobody wants to find, to silence stories like that. But when that story comes with, and it can't possibly be happening to you because it's not happening to me, that's not okay. It's not
And
okay
it's
when men do it. It's not okay when women do it.
absolutely, and it's not okay for anyone of any gender identity. And what's interesting is, if anything, she's sort of illuminating how pervasive actually gender bias is, because she says you just have to look to find it, right? So if anything, what she's really showing without realizing is it's so pervasive that if you just open your eyes, you'll see it.
Interesting.
That's how I see that.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that, Izzy. I know that that is not easy. So I'm going to share some things too. I've thought a bit about what I'm going to share. And first I'll say that I think you and I have touched on some of these conversations at times while I've known you, but I backed off from some of them because, you know, you've been a student at Clarkson, and I didn't want to, you know, color your experience in any way. But you're about to graduate, you know. You're not in my classes, you're not, you know, all the letters of recommendation are written, you're, you know, you're just about fully launched. You've got how much more time left as a student? I don't know. So and also I've been reflecting more on the importance of telling stories, even if they are hard stories. So I'm not sure, maybe it would have even been better if I told some of these stories earlier. I don't know. I'm not going to question that, but I'm going to tell a few. And first, I want to set him in context a little bit. One of the things that I really loved about the Picture a Scientist movie is that there's a graphic of an iceberg. And it shows part of the iceberg floating above the waterline and then a bunch of stuff below the waterline. And in that picture, let me see if I can even like bring it up here to look at myself so I get it right. I took a little screenshot while I was watching you know, that, you know, it says that above the water line is, let me get it here. Give me a second. I want to get it right. Sorry, hold on a minute. Yeah, so it says like above the waterline are things like unwanted sexual attention, coercion, and assault. And then it says below the water lines are things like subtle exclusions, not being given credit for your work, being left off of an email, not being invited to collaborate, vulgar name calling, obscene gestures, hostility, passed over for promotion, things like that. And I really reflected on this above the waterline and below the waterline concept. And I think that that definition of it is very true. But there's some other versions of it too, I think. I also think about things that are witnessed by others that happen in public, or there's a clear written chain of documents or emails, or maybe there's even a recording, something like that. And the things that happen in private where you would have no corroboration for what you're saying. And, you know, I can't tell you how often I have come to someone in authority and said, I want you to take action on these things that I can prove in writing that were witnessed by others. And having them say things like, well, I'm sure they didn't mean it. It's just that once, you know, like, and I have said back, I'm not even asking you to take action on the things that I can't prove. I'm not even talking to you about the things that were subtler or happened in private. Please don't just excuse the things that the few things I can prove. Do you realize what a small part of the issue we're talking about? And then also, I regularly will see things like, oh, I don't want to talk about things from the past. I've only been in this position of authority for this amount of time. I don't want to talk about anything that happened while I wasn't in charge. And I'll say, okay, these are the things that happened. I can prove them in writing while you were in charge. Can we act on those? No, not really. We can't act on those. And that's really hard. That's hard. So I think my stories feel certainly below the waterline, more below that one type of waterline than yours. You know, I'm not going to tell stories of coercion or assault, thankfully. But subtle exclusions, not being given credit, being left off of email, not being invited to collaborate, not being consulted when I'm a clear expert, name calling, hostility, passed over for promotion. Those are a regular part of my life. And not in the distant past. You know, in the past, in the present, they happen all the time. So the first story I'll tell is I did a radio interview for NCPR as part of this film festival, and this was the story I told a bit there. I don't know if you heard that interview, but basically a while ago, so I have a diverse background, and computer security is one of the expertises that I have. I believe I was the first person to ever teach a computer security class at Clarkson. I don't think there ever was one before. And I have publications in computer security. I've given regularly talks at really prestigious places like DEF CON. I have internationally known expertise. And there was funding offered to the university, I think, and it wasn't small change. It might have been at like $600,000, something like that, to do some cybersecurity work. It wasn't like NSF funding where a team of people were putting in a peer review, a proposal to be peer reviewed. It was a little more like, oh, this is funding we'd like to go to a university in upstate New York. There's all sorts of different ways that funding is procured by Congress, and sometimes there's a desire for it to be spread around congressional district. There's all sorts of things, but I believe basically the funding was offered to the university, and they designated someone to lead that project, who, as far as I know, really had no particular expertise in computer security. And that person actually came and asked me to borrow an undergraduate computer security textbook from me. Doesn't that feel like a warning sign that ought to have gone off? Like, I am not the one who should be leading this. And not only, it's both the people who tried to give that role to someone and the person who took it. Mm-hmm. That's not okay. And later, I believe that saying, like not too long after that, that person won the best research award at Clarkson at graduation. And I'm like, for what exactly? That wasn't a peer-reviewed project. What can you remind me exactly what was the good impact on the world of that exactly? You're going to give someone credit for leading a project that had a fair amount of money attached to it when it was given to them. And then not too long after that, that person was promoted, and even into a position of authority over me. So, that's not so cool, right? And I mourn the work that could have been done with that money, because we had in my team what I consider to be very impactful computer security ideas. And those were not the ones that happened. So it's not just a matter of impact on me. It's an impact on a loss to the world of what could have been. And that is by far not the only example of that. I went back and consulted some of the facts before this call, so I'd be sure that I would get them right. It was around 2013 that there was a proposal for a master's in data analytics. And this is especially relevant to you because you're in data science and data analytics. So I think this might have been the first program in that general area at Clarkson. And even before that, I had been working very hard on the issues that are brought up by the coded bias film, issues of surveillance and privacy and bias in data analytics. And a bit before that program was proposed, there had been a smart dorm project. And I had been very strong in the opinion that it was not okay to surveil students heavily without clearly explaining to them the types of implications or conclusions you could draw from that data. I wanted to make it a key aspect of the proposal that we clearly show the kind of conclusions we could get, that students are able to see their own data and not reveal it to others, that we show them the kind of implications, sometimes a little sneaky, scary, things you can tell about someone from their data, and then ask them what they're willing to contribute. Mm-hmm. And that was not a popular position, but it was the right one, in my opinion, as being, being shown by the impact of this surveillance tech throughout social media platforms and big data and all of these things. And I don't know if it was, I think the first case I told you about, the security project, I think that was probably just gender bias. I don't know if there's more to it than that. I really can't explain why in the world you wouldn't put the most qualified person for something in charge, or at least consult them heavily. I can't explain that. In the case of the first program in data analytics, I suspect it was because I had taken a strong, what I consider to be a principled position about wanting to include that in that project. It turns out my daughter Abigail actually lived in one of those dorms later, and regularly fought back against saying no. They wanted her to take this like political opinion survey, and she basically said, that's incredibly revealing. I feel like, that's not something I want to reveal. They really wanted her to do it. She ended up sending them a whole list of peer-reviewed publications about the risks of doing those things and why that's not cool. And I think eventually they let her, not do it. But they were kind of like, you agreed, if you lived in this housing, you were going to do this. And she pushed back on it. But I think many students, what I had wanted to happen in terms of really helping students understand the ways in which conclusions about them could be drawn, and they might not, they might be much more personally identifiable in a data set than they think, did not happen. And I looked back in my email chain about this. There, right at that time that the MS in data analytics was happening, the computer science chair said, there are no computer science faculty members on the committee, and I think there needs to be computer science involvement to make this successful. And I remember that was partly me saying, like, what is going on here? And then the person in charge of that had said something that said, special thanks to the interdisciplinary committee. I imagine it was challenging to get engineers, mathematicians, statisticians, computer scientists, economists, and IS faculty all to come to consensus in just a few months. But they did cut computer science completely out. And I believe they did it to cut me out, because I already had a reputation of working in this field. I had expertise in this field, and I had a strong opinion that they didn't want to hear. And it could also be gender bias. You can say, if a man had taken that position, would he have been treated differently? And I also remember the Clarkson media team interviewing me about big data right about the same time this program was coming out. And them trying to like put a little conclusion. It was from something else, from work I was doing, that they were following up on and wanted to put in the news. And them wanting to kind of draw a conclusion, like, but at least there, like there's ethics now in the data science program. And me, basically, I don't believe that there was ethics at all in that first program. And I would have insisted on it. I think it did go in later, but and partly from me pushing and complaining about it. But it's not like they said, Jeanna, you were right. Can we work together to put that in there? It was more like, oh, we'll put that in there, but we won't acknowledge that idea came from Jeanna, or, anything of the kind. I do think that ethics is part of the programs today, but I think computer science is not. And I have heard you say that you think you didn't get the kind of deep programming, or the money that people in the data science program don't get some of the programming that they really need. Maybe you could speak to that. Don't let me put words in your mouth. Do you feel like there's been a missing programming or computer science element in that program?
Um, I don't. I mean, I guess it's definitely more computationally heavy than the other math majors. I mean, I think that I've definitely spoken to the fact that I don't feel as confident programming, and like in some of the courses I've taken for that are required, like a 400 level comp learning course, although a lot of that course was theoretical, but sort of learning Python on the fly for that course, where people I worked with, a close friend of mine, he graduated with a degree in computer science, and we worked together a lot. And I definitely relied heavily on him for help with the programming, where I felt more confident with the theory and the math. But I don't feel like I can speak to making curriculums and programs, but I
I don't
can.
I don't want to I definitely
Yeah.
don't want to put words in your mouth, but
Mhm.
I thought I remembered you saying, like, you've taken some classes where there really could have been a computing element and it was really
Yes.
taught very
Mhm.
theoretically, and you wish that it was a bit more hands-on, a bit more
Yes, I have
programming
definitely.
focused.
Yes, definitely. I have felt definitely like some of the courses maybe, which I have voiced to other people as well, that especially some of the statistics courses or things like that. There's a lot of, which I don't think there's anything wrong with starting with pen and paper and theory, but I felt like we were using either software that's not being used by data scientists. We weren't using or we weren't getting support in using things that were like R or Python. So yeah, absolutely. In those courses specifically, I
And there may
definitely.
be very many people associated with that program now that weren't even around when it was put together, or people who weren't really in the deciding, making the decisions about whether computer science in general or me or ethics should be involved. And they're just doing the best they can with the program, and also evolving the program and putting more and more things in it. And I think, like I said, I think there's ethics in there now. I think there's more and more R and things like that in the program. So
Mhm.
it's not, it's, and here's another thing I'd really like to say, and I think we've said this to one another, is we want acknowledgement and apologies and change, not so much vilification. That's not the point. The
Mhm.
point is growth. The point is change. But I do think that this is another example of where, by Xing out qualified voices at the beginning, it continues to impact people down the line, right? There is a loss, there is a tax for many people, because the people who should have been at the table were not, they were X'd out of the table, whether that is for gender, or whether it's for, um, desire to see ethics curriculum at a time when that wasn't a popular opinion. It's hard, hard to know. Um, And I know my daughter and I have talked a lot about this, that many times it gets messy. It's not apples to apples. It's hard to put exactly your finger on, is this just gender bias, or is it more complicated than that? But when you see, again, if I look at that list of things below the waterline, subtle exclusions, being left off an email, not given credit, not being invited to collaborate, not being consulted when you're the expert, name calling, passed over for promotions, etc. It's, like, it's like, yep, yep,
Mhm.
yep, 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 and yep. So, and these aren't even the only examples. The CS PhD program is another one. When I came to Clarkson in 2000, there was a PhD for computer scientists. The PhD program that you could train students in was basically mathematics or engineering science. And neither one of those are the degrees that would be appropriate for the students that work with me. Now, some of the CS faculty had a more theoretical bent, and for them, maybe training a student as a mathematician might have been more acceptable. For me, in very applied fields like operating systems and computer security and computer networks, that would not have been acceptable. And so very much from the first time I came to Clarkson, I was asking about a PhD in computer science. And then I went to Cornell for a few years around 2002, 2003, in kind of complicated situation where my son, who was around 5 at the time, needed some, health interventions that he wasn't really getting in our local area. And then I eventually came back to Clarkson, but, so there's a little interruption in that, but I was constantly asking, for a PhD program. And eventually in around 2006, I just started investigating on my own. I went and got the information from the New York State Education Department. I started like putting together the program and all the materials. And, the other folks in computer science were supportive, but they didn't really want to do the heavy lifting for it. They were happy enough with the situation as it was. And I was the driving force behind the CS PhD program. I think anyone involved in that situation, if they were honest, would say that that was true. And then the credit for that program was clearly given to somebody else. And in fact, someone who drug their heels about getting in the external reviewers we needed and everything. And that person also went on to get, to be a department chair and, and in that particular case, I actually talked to that person about it some years later, and they admitted to me. They said I didn't take credit for it, but when it was given to me, I didn't correct that misassignment of credit.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked them to put that in writing, and they said they would, but then they decided they wouldn't. And that's another example of where it continues to affect people to this day. Only like, I think it was last week or the week before that, we had a department meeting in which some newer faculty were saying things like, we've had questions about the CS PhD for years that no one has answered. We asked the department chair to explain, and we never really got answers. And I feel like, well, that's because no one told you to talk to me. I could have answered your questions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And, in the last year, I can think of 3 clear examples where in public, in a meeting, a male faculty member said something untrue and quite uncivil about me. And in one case, other people as well. And in all 3 of those instances, no one said anything. I spoke up and said, I don't believe that to be factual. And, I don't believe that to be fair. And then the reaction was, oh, let's not talk about that. I literally got called a liar in a department meeting. And I sent an email to the person who was running the meeting, including people who are above me, proving that I'm not a liar. And the issue was never, was I telling the truth or not? Nothing ever came back and said, yeah, she was telling the truth. Nothing like that. Or let's discuss whether that was true or not. But, and no one said, don't say that. I said that that's not, and I was asking like a point of clarification about the way we do Robert's Rules of Order and what goes in the minutes and like things like that. And, when it wasn't until I spoke up and said, that's not okay, that it was like, oh no, let's not talk about that. One of the other instances was actually another thing that is somewhat related to you. And this one is totally, completely in writing. It was all in email. Somebody said that the 600 level classes that I teach are not, let me see if I can, I did a little looking for facts, so I make sure I get it right. They said, these are not 600, speaking of the classes that I teach, they said, these are not 600 level PhD courses as they have no technical rigor. These are seminars or even workshops. Nobody said anything, crickets. And in that case, I waited a while. In the case of the liar, I did respond fairly quickly. So it could have been that someone would have jumped in and said something if I hadn't. But in this case, I let it ride a while and nobody said anything. And then when I spoke up and basically said, I don't think that's factual. I don't think it's civil. I don't think it's so many things. That was when it was like, we're going to shut this conversation down. You know, that is outrageous to me.
That you are seen as the aggressor.
I was seen as the aggressor. Because I was basically, and you and I talked about this. We did a little conversation just to kind of preview a little what we thought we were going to say. And you had a great line. Let me see. I have it somewhere. You said, vilified for disrupting the tolerated harms of systems of oppression. I have regularly been vilified for wanting credit for my work, vilified for calling out incivility on the part of others, vilified for defending myself when someone says something that is factually inaccurate about me. And I believe that some people classify me as a bully for doing so.
Yes, I think that is really, I think that is common for women. I think it's especially common for women of color, particularly Black women, right, to be seen as aggressive for speaking up for yourself. I even had an incident, it wasn't related to science or work this past summer, but I had a friend, he said something that was transphobic, and I let him know that I thought what he said was transphobic. And he got very defensive, and I was driving and he's sitting behind me and he's yelling at me from behind, which it feels very unsafe and uncomfortable for me. And I just stood my ground and I was like, I don't think I'm calling you a bad person. I just think the thing you said was transphobic, and you're not going to convince me otherwise. And here's why. And I can send you resources on these subjects. And he got really upset and he was yelling at me. And I remember like raising my voice to be like, you are interrupting me. Like do not interrupt me. And I just really stood my ground. And the other person in the car, who is a man who I'm close to, he afterwards was upset at me and said that I was being aggressive. Used the word aggressive. And I was like, you only think that I'm being aggressive because you're so used to him being aggressive that was just normal from him. And then when I stood my ground and I didn't even fully match him, when he started to talk louder, I was like, you in the same volume as him said, like, you will stop interrupting me now. That was the aggressive moment, right? Because you're not used to seeing me that way, and that I stepped out of my lane, that women aren't supposed to be speaking that way. And I was like, this is incredibly sexist that you think that I was the aggressor here, when A, I was standing up for someone else's human rights, and B, I was advocating for myself not to be interrupted in this conversation.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. And so given the same behavior, if anything, I was less aggressive, just objectively using volume of my voice, like level of interruptions, like even the intonations and the tone in which I was speaking. I think if you looked at those objective, sort of like I don't know, those objective measures of aggression, if you will, in a conversation, I exhibited less of those. But again, it took me a bit to convince the bystander who stayed silent the whole time, that I was not the aggressor of the situation. And I was like, if anything, I'm upset at you because you didn't say anything as well. And I feel like that is a common theme when you are disrupting, again, right, those tolerated harms. So we find transphobia to be something that is tolerated, in many cases, especially more subtle cases, but even overtly, especially for trans folks. And so I disrupted that tolerated harm, and therefore I am the aggressor. And it seems like you experience that a lot. And in this case, you're talking a lot about it in the workplace. And I think that computer science also is such a male dominated field, and there are so many, which is frustrating because women invented so many parts of computer science. But uh, uh, yeah, I've heard a lot from you on that, and it just seems like consistent and unrelenting.
And, like in the one instance, the entire conversation is in email. The entire thing is in writing.
Mm,
And I still can't get anyone to do anything about it. You can see, like, I'm like bending over backwards to say, can we have a standard of fact-based civil conversation? Men can say things that are outrageous and the reaction is appeasement.
mm,
And if I don't even say anything outrageous, if I just defend myself or insist on the facts, like what you said is factually inaccurate,
mm-hmm,
then that's bullying, and the conversation has to be shut down to protect the person who said that from me.
mm-hmm.
How can that be? How can it be that they allow that to go on? I really I cannot understand it. And as you said, I think women of color have it much worse because there is very much the stereotype of an angry Black woman, right? And I think sometimes I get cast as an angry woman, and I'm not particularly angry. I am persistent. I am factual. I am maybe unrelenting when I believe I'm right. But I think I have a right to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We had these crucial conversations training, and I found it very interesting. This is another one that I looked up just to make sure I was getting it right. See if I can find it. They said the only limit to how, give me a second. I want to get this one correct. I have it somewhere. They said our only limit to how strongly we can express our opinion is our willingness to be equally vigorous in encouraging others to challenge it. And I've really reflected on this. I did kind of a checkup from the neck up. I watched my behavior, and I see that I regularly say, I want to hear your opinion. I want to hear your side. If I've ever done something that you find uncivil or not based in fact, please tell me. I constantly invite dialogue, but when I want to insist on accountability, I am silenced.
Mm-hmm. And it's, I'm thinking about when you said it was another woman in the meeting, and I think that that's something that we don't like to talk about. But I think it was Maisha Hill. She's actually an anti-racism educator, and she's incredible. And if you check out Check Your Privilege is her platform on social media. But she said patriarchy has no gender. And I think that it's important to note that we can all uphold patriarchy in different ways, and that doesn't make men any less responsible for patriarchy. But I have experienced that myself and felt very conflicted and uncomfortable because it's been from, at Clarkson, sometimes professors who are women. And I feel like then I am, I don't know, I have a harder time saying something, or I mean, I think I'm more careful to take my time to think about it. But that's another really tricky layer to navigate.
Women can be just as much enforcing the patriarchy or enforcing gender bias, forcing sexism as men. That's absolutely true.
And so it sounds like in that meeting, right, it was a woman who said, well, if you look for it, you can find it, but that doesn't mean it's there, which doesn't actually make sense. But uh, uh, I've had that as well, where I was, I was speaking up in a class, and we were talking about sexual violence, and I felt like we weren't talking about it in a trauma-informed way. And I spoke up in the class. I felt like the professor, she was saying things that were rape myths and were harmful. And I was thinking about 19-year-old Izzy in this class would not have thought, oh, this is bull. I would have internalized it. And that was when I was really on the track to failing out of school. And I've spoken to her at length about it. And, she told me that I wanted students to be spoon fed and that we're adults and we need to be dealing with these conversations. And eventually said, that she respected my opinions and my demands for what I thought was right, but it was not her interest. It's not her expertise, and she's not going to do anything different. And I've just struggled with how to even handle that. And it was confusing coming from a professor who's a woman who's talking about gender and sexuality. And yeah, it's a really, yeah. And I mean, I still haven't decided exactly what I'm going to do about it, but that's another one of those like other layers of complexity, because you feel like you're not a feminist which isn't true, right? But if you're like holding other women accountable for their harm to systems or of oppression or things like, for example, sexual violence that disproportionately impact women. So I don't know. I guess I just want to speak to that sounds, and you said, I had to think about it and feel like, what exactly is it that felt wrong? And I don't know if sometimes that's part of what makes us pause.
That definitely felt like a gut punch to me. Like there was, I think, 7 women that we had went and asked for this follow-up conversation. And then right out of the gate, it was another woman who wanted to shut it down. And I really did have to think about it, because it's not that I don't want a woman who's had good experiences to own that experience and talk about them. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it steps over into your experience didn't happen, that's sexism. That is not okay. And, I think the Picture a Scientist movie really hits this point as well. There's a scene where these women at MIT who gathered a ton of data, are saying eventually it comes down to, it doesn't matter what your experience is, and it matters what the data is. And, they were talking about another scientist and basically saying that's the standard you'd want applied to data in science, right? Why can you not view this data in the same way? Right? It's not just one person's, you don't get to dismiss the data because you
Mhm.
had a different experience.
Yes. Yeah.
Regardless, you don't get to dismiss someone else's experience because of your experience, or even because of the data, right? Like everyone gets to own their own experience.
Mhm.
And those are individual data points. To understand the ocean rather than the incident, we have to look at the data
Mhm.
and
And
let that matter, and let the facts matter, and not sweep it under the rug. The other thing that drives me crazy is this desire to like sweep it under the rug to avoid embarrassing someone.
Mhm.
I don't think asking for an apology or documenting that something occurred is vilification.
Mhm.
You get to own the facts of what happened. You get to say that the facts matter, and they don't get to hide from those facts. They can respond with so many things. They could respond with, I wasn't thinking about it that way. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'm going to think about it some more. They can respond with, I'm sorry, you're right. They can they can respond in many ways.
Mhm.
But another thing that bothers me is apologies that are like, I'm sorry you felt that way.
Ugh. Yes.
I even looked up this thing about like what uh the elements of an effective apology. Let me see if I can get that here. So this was a reference from Ohio State University, and I don't know the really, who said this, but it seemed good to me that effective apologies contain an expression of regret, an explanation of what went wrong, an acknowledgement of responsibility, a declaration of repentance, an offer of repair, and a request for forgiveness. I would really love to see more effective apologies, and I would love to see apologies that happen in the same scope as the harm, you know, um,
Mhm.
because like that incident, one of those instances that happened in a group of, I think, 70 people, I think there might have been a private apology involved, but there were a lot more people affected than just the person who was directly targeted. And it wasn't me, by the way. Um, but I felt affected watching it happen. And I know that there were, younger women who felt affected, because when we had this follow-up conversation, there was at least one that said, I feel affected by this.
Mhm.
Um,
And I will.
um,
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say there was even like one of the ROTC commanders, a man, said something like, the military has the stereotype of being a very gendered place. And I think it is, but I think Clarkson is worse. When things, when people say it, and it just drives me crazy that we can't seem to get acknowledgement and apologies and action. And
Mhm.
what I have been saying, and what this group of women we decided to ask for is, you can't make someone apologize. So if the person who did it isn't willing to apologize, then if there's an administrator that witnessed it, we want them to put in writing, I witnessed it. It is not okay with me. That is not the way we do things here. And I acknowledge that you're affected by this.
Mhm.
Doesn't that seem reasonable?
Yes, that is more than reasonable. And I think there was something that I wanted to add to this. I had listened to I think her name is Harriet Lerner. She's a psychologist, and she actually studies apologies. And she wrote some book in the 80s about like anger. So she's been around for a long time. And she went on Brene Brown's podcast. If people don't know who Brene Brown is, she's an activist, but she's also, her PhD I think is in social work. She studies shame a lot, and emotion. And Harriet Lerner also talked about like the importance of what makes up a good apology and why some things feel good and some things don't feel good. And I will say that one thing that differed from that definition that you brought in was that, to not ask for forgiveness. And I think that that's one thing that I would agree with, actually, because people don't owe you forgiveness. And I think that people want, they want, again, this immediate, I don't know, the
Maybe
urgency.
an immediate absolution. Like, it's almost like, let's just leave this under the rug. I said, I'm sorry. Now we're done. Right. No damage. It's like the plate is broken. You don't, you haven't like, you haven't super glued it back together and somehow made it just as good as it was before. That's not what happened here.
Yeah, and so I think that was one thing that stuck out to me. Although, like, I agree with all the other parts, and I think that maybe there's a tactful way to show that you want to do what it takes to get forgiveness if that's possible. But I think what people often do, especially people who are causing harm in these big ways, they're like, I apologize, like, get over it, and they're demanding forgiveness, or they're demanding for it to be quiet now. And that's not an apology, that's bullying in a costume.
I'm so glad you said that. That is a really good modification to that thing that I learned somewhere that is not as good as it could be. I'll try to look up Harriet Lerner. Thank you for that. Yeah. And there's one more story along this line that I wanted to tell. I told you I was going to have a list of things, and there's things that if we didn't get to, great, but there's things I wanted to get to. I wanted to say that even just in the last year, there was a master's in AI proposal put forward. And originally they absolutely refused to add me to it. They said that they didn't think my courses had sufficient programming or mathematical rigor. Now, I have heard many women of color, like Joy Buolamwini, Encoded Bias, will say, like, she'll get this kind of lack of rigor, lack of whatever kind of argument. I have a PhD in computer science from one of the top 4 computer science departments in the world. I was in operating systems, for God's sakes. You don't get much more programming rigor than that. I have an undergraduate degree in mathematics, in addition to the degrees I have in computer science. And I have an international reputation in AI. Mm-hmm. Just recently, I became the vice chair of IEEE's AI Policy Committee. Now, how embarrassing would it look for Clarkson if they basically said, this woman with an international reputation, we don't even think she's good enough to be faculty on our MS in AI program. Mm-hmm. But that decision would have stood if someone above our department didn't make a change.
Really? And outside of the department?
It had to go outside of the department. And, so, okay, good. This one did change. Data science didn't, that security grant didn't. But okay, so this MS in AI did. But that's just not okay. And that same line of questioning my rigor, it's crazy. And I said, the point is not whether a particular research paper or, the course has programming rigor or mathematical rigor. It was talking about basically the 600 level classes like you took with me, right? Saying this is what is publishable now. This is what the field as a whole defines to be appropriate work in AI.
Yeah, I will just mention that in that course, I worked on it was a deep learning project, it was the collaboration with you and Nick, that ended up getting published in Foundations of Data Science conference. So, and it was very technical, and yes, so I'll just add to that came from that course, a paper we read, actually, which interestingly, Timnit Gebru, right? The data sheets for data sets and model cards for model reporting was sort of the inspiration to audit my own system that my own forecast that I built with Nick at Bigelow. And also because a lot of the work that we've done before had been auditing systems. So, and of course, Timnit Gebru just got pushed out of Google.
I was just going to say, Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell, that is a just horrible story. Recent New York Times article, basically Google firing the head of their AI ethics team. and vilifying them, allowing them to be trolled online, like, you know, basically almost encouraging it. It's just sick and horrible.
Absolutely. But I guess I just wanted to put it out there for anyone that I took that course and worked on a very technical research project that got published at a data science conference. And one of the organizers of the conference even, you know, gave a positive feedback to my talk there. David Madigan, I think, right? You know him. He's a
Yeah, he was on that Magic Grant project, statistician from Columbia, former dean of arts and sciences at Columbia. Yeah, so mathematical rigor. You know? And even that's not the point. It isn't necessary. The point is, are you solving big problems in the world?
yes.
It's not whether you had to program up an operating system or whether you had to propose a new mathematical theory. If those are the right tools, then bring them to the table. If they are not the right tools, then solve them with the tools that solve the problem. It doesn't change that it is an important problem in a technical space that needs desperately to be solved. Yeah. I mean, I just feel over and over again with these things that I can prove them in writing. I can clearly demonstrate the facts that back up what I'm saying. And I invite other people to bring their facts and have discussion. And I am silenced. So there's that. but not everywhere. You know, outside of Clarkson, I am known as a leader who you want to be in the room. You know, just a few weeks ago, I had the honor of being one of 4 people who were speaking to staff from the House Appropriations Committee on Commerce, Justice, and Science. That's the folks that fund NSF and NASA and DOJ and NIST. And there were 4 speakers. There was Marshall Hebert, who's the Dean of Computing at CMU. So one of the top 4 computer science departments in the world, the dean of it, in fact. There was Dan Ho, who is, I believe, the director of human-centered AI, I believe, at Stanford. You know, also one of the top places in the world for computer science. There was someone from Amazon, and there was me. And so, you know, this is the story, right? If your local environment won't listen to you, if you're, you know, but we have to pay the tax to go find another platform, and we have to work harder. And that shouldn't be that way. And people lose out. They lose out on the contributions that the world could have had if you're not paying the tax of hardly being able to concentrate on brainstorming of research ideas. And they lose out on the tax of when someone who is not as qualified is put in charge. We all lose.
And I think that that's another piece that I wasn't thinking about for today, but is now coming up, that I think a lot of people don't talk about. I think about it a lot in the sense of sexual violence, but the community impacts. People think that it's a thing that happens to one person and it's isolated and it's this one incident on this one person and that person is a victim, and they don't realize like these community impacts of this systemic problem. And I think that you know, we talk about the impacts on ourselves as individuals, as the people who are receiving the brunt of this, right? You are the one who's doing this important work, who's being silenced and being accused of not doing important work or not doing rigorous work. And on top of it, the field is missing out on the important work that could be done. The school is missing out on the important work. The students are missing out on being a part of the important work, right? And so it's much larger than us, and people don't like to talk about that.
that was definitely a lesson I saw really clearly with that one incident I told you, where there was, something that happened and then we revisited it the next meeting. It was, like when something was said in the first meeting, it was basically a fairly senior woman said something, basically said, we did a bunch of work. Why haven't you responded to it? If I could summarize what was said. And there was basically a very condescending reaction, like just basically trying to silence her. And it was a very gendered response. A bunch of women were saying in the chat, that was a good point, and then one woman actually, instead of just supporting the person who was targeted, had the bravery and the presence of mind to actually call out the person who did or actually the people who were doing the condescending, and those of us who had spoken up in the chat a little kind of found one another and decided to debrief a little.
Mm.
And we said, basically, we all feel really impacted by having watched this happen. We said that we couldn't, it was in that group of people who collectively represented, I believe, like 80 years of experience at Clarkson, couldn't remember a single time that a male colleague had been spoken to that way, but we could remember multiple times of women being spoken to that way, or ourselves being spoken, and including ourselves being spoken to that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we went and said we really wanted to revisit it in that same meeting. Now, of course, you don't recapture the same people, because it's not like all of the same people who were there the first time are there the second time. And then just after bringing it up, there's an attempt to shut it down by another woman. And then there was a younger woman who spoke up and said, yes, I feel very affected by this. And you think about what the tax it plays on an associate professor who doesn't have tenure yet, that sees a senior professor be shut down in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I want better for you. And I want better for Abby, and I want better for me. Abby's my daughter, by the way, for people watching this who don't know that. And I want better for everyone. I don't want this to happen to anyone of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
And I want it all to have the benefit of the good work of having the people with actual expertise. We can see all around us the cost we all pay when someone who is not qualified is put in leadership, can we not?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Again and again and again. And that's the misogyny tax. And that's the racism tax.
Mm-hmm. Among others. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Many others.
Yeah.
Many others.
Yeah. And it's, yeah. And I agree. I think, and it's interesting again when you say, someone else immediately shuts it down. And I guess I've been thinking about this, that sometimes I think that there is some tension between different generations of women sometimes in talking about what feminism looks like, what we should be asking for, what we should feel entitled to. And I have had conversations with women who are older than me who have felt like, you know, millennials or women my age are, don't recognize what they went through, or we feel so entitled to things that they work so hard for. And, or like, it's not so bad. What we dealt with was this, like, you're only dealing with something else. And, I think Glennon Doyle was talking about it, and she said that she has to sort of check herself when she's thinking about this and saying, isn't the goal that the work that we do will make the change so that the younger generations of women feel entitled to that, and then they will make changes for the next generation to feel entitled to it. Don't we want the younger women to feel entitled to these changes that we asked for, that we made, that we worked so hard for? And sometimes I think that part is forgotten, and that the entitlement is important. we should be entitled to feel comfortable in meetings, to be in the meetings at
I
all.
want you to be entitled to that.
Yeah.
I want to be entitled to that.
Mhm.
I want everyone to be entitled to that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing with me.
Thank you for sharing with me. I feel lucky to have you and other folks to do this kind of hard emotional work together. This is not easy. This is not stuff we talk about often.
Mhm.
Or I don't know, maybe you talk about it often. This is not stuff I talk about often.
I talk about
Good.
I never thought about it.
Already better than me. I tell Abby all the time, I want you to be better at everything than me, every single thing. Yeah. Well, big hug from far away.
Yes.
Thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to send you, I'll upload this probably to like Google Drive and send you a link to it so you can check it out and see if you feel good about sharing it, and or edit if there's anything we want to edit. But I'm going to stop recording, I think.
Okay.